Hey guys, welcome back to Cereal and Midnight. My name is Heath Holland, and in this episode, we're talking to Detlev Hoegen, the CEO of Bear Family Records. Now, this is huge for me because Bear Family is really at the top of the mountain when it comes to catalog, music, reissue labels. They have set the bar, really. They set the bar that everybody else needs to aim for. They have done so much preservation, curation. I'm going to add contextualization too, because they give us context for the music that we already know and love, but they give us the scene, they give us the imagery, they give us the story of that particular time and place. And they've done these huge spanning box sets, a career spanning, or if it's not a career spanning set, it's a snapshot in time of this moment. They did a Jerry Lee Lewis at Sun Records, which is exhaustive. They've done things with Johnny Cash, Johnny Cash's catalog with Merle Haggard and George Jones, and they did the Louisiana Hayride box set, which is 20 discs. If you know the Louisiana Hayride, that's Elvis would perform on. Wanda Jackson was there. These are the foundations of music as we know it. This is what really created the culture that influenced our culture. You know, the last 70 plus years of musical history. And Bear Family has been there for the better part of 50 years. In 2025, the company turns 50. Detlev has been there as a CEO for years now, and getting to talk to him about the focus of the company, what they do, what remains to be done, was really interesting to me. And I know it's going to be interesting to you too. I want to shout out a few more of some of their lines, right? They have a line called the Rocks, which is focusing on sort of rockabilly and the rock side of certain artists. One of my favorites is the Destination series. We got Destination Desert, we got Destination Jail, we got Destination Summer Sea Cruise, Destination Freeway, and I think my new personal favorite, I just can't stop listening to this, Destination Jurassic Land. 33 artifacts from times before Christ. So it's songs, again, from the 1950s mostly, about cavemen and dinosaurs and whatever. And some of them are even instrumental, but they've got the title that really connects it to that thing, right? Deeply done with so much knowledge is what it is. And presenting the imagery and all the facts about those releases. I want to shout out these two releases, which I cannot stop listening to. Shotgun Boogie, Rhythm and Blues Goes Country. So this is going to be R&B artists, again, from the 50s, usually maybe into the early 60s, covering country standards. And then Beaten on country music, which is beat bands. You know, beat music from Europe from the early to mid 1960s. That's beat bands covering country music. I also am a fan of their Connections series. Two of the latest ones are the Hank Williams Connection, the Wanda Jackson Connection. It's going to be artists that they covered, songs that they covered, and then other people covering their stuff as well. The fusion of how it all swirls around, and these are the connections that I'm talking about, right? This deeply curated sense of like, well, here's this music, but here's why it's cool. They don't just dump it with no context. They really present to you why this is special, why this music matters, and by the time you have spent a little bit of time with it, you know an awful lot about the scene. It is making the education of the history of the past really fun. I compare them to Bear Family. For me, is kind of like the Quentin Tarantino of the music industry, because they present things that have been done before in a way that feels incredibly fresh and new, and it feels hip and cool, and you just can't help but gravitate to it. And so getting to talk to Detlev here was an absolute treat for me. There's some revelations here. There's some stuff about what's coming next, a look past, a look now, and a look into the future. This was a tremendous thrill for me. All the links that you need are going to be in the description of this episode, so just scroll down and there is everything that you need to know. Thanks so much to Detlev. Without further ado, Bear Family Records. You've been well established in the music sphere for many years now, and I'm curious how you got started in what launched your love of music. You know, you personally, there's Crosscut Records, which you started back in 1981, well before your time at Bear Family, correct? What led you down the path of music?
Well, that's a longer story because it has something to do with the history in Europe and after World War II. I got interested in American music by listening to the radio stations of the forces that were stationed here in Germany. I was born in the central western part of Germany, so I could listen to BFBS Cologne, I could listen to AFN, American Forces Network in Frankfurt, and very close to where I live, we had Canadian troops, and they had their own radio station, Canadian Forces Network, and they had request times. And in those days, I remember, people were asking for, let's say, Petula Clark, Roy Orbison, and suddenly one day a guy requested "Let Your Hair Down, Baby" by T-Bone Walker. And I was like 12 or 13 years old, and that was the weirdest sound I'd ever heard or listened to before. And so, another day somebody was asking for the Hoochie Coochie Man by Muddy Waters. And so I got interested, off mainstream music. Not so much listening to German Schlager music on the net. In those days, there wasn't really pop music in Germany on the air. So everything was limited to German Schlager music, very simple pop music and orchestral. Orchestras performing, hits of the day or, swing music and, of course, classical music. So that's when I started developing an interest in American music. I started buying records in England because I couldn't find them in Germany. Um, and then, I started and actually, I'm a scientist in terms of education, sociology, and all that, but I never performed that. So, but I started collecting records, and I was into blues, I was into psychedelic music from the West Coast. Later, I developed an interest through the Grateful Dead for, let's say, basic vintage American music, bluegrass, old-timey stuff. So my horizon got a little wider, and but what I never really got into was popular music and rock, mainstream rock music. That was never my cup of tea. So and by accident, I learned that people that I knew, one was the owner of my local record store here in town in Bremen, in Germany. And he had founded a mail order company in 1977, I think that was. I was still going to university, and they were importing rare records from the US and selling them in auctions and in set sale lists over here. So, I started working there part-time, and then finally I became one of their partners. And then, after a couple of years, I decided to do it by myself and founded Crosscut Records, which I did for, my God, 25 years or so, all by myself. And then I sold the mail order part to Bear Family, became the third director in the company, and kept my label. And when Richard Weitzer, the company's owner, decided to more or less retire 10 years ago, one of the old-time and long-time employees of the company and myself, we took over, the wheel and, tried to keep Bear Family alive. So that's my story in, short words.
You said try to keep Bear Family alive. The industry, the music industry, and even the home entertainment industry has been through some really tumultuous times over the last 20 years or so with MP3s. Now
Mhm.
we have iTunes, we have Apple Music and Spotify, and so many millions of people stream music. How has your side of the business weathered those changes? Has it been a challenge over the last decade or two to keep things moving along?
Well, I don't think that, keeping up with the digital developments is a challenge. We are more or less fighting with demographical problems. The people that we have been catering to are growing older and older, like myself. So, so definitely it was easier, let's say, in the 1990s to supply stuff directly to the record collectors. But this generation of collectors that's were born, let's say, in the 1940s and even in the 1930s, they are just, disappearing. They are dying. And I think that's more or less my concern and the challenge right now. The digital sales and digital platforms like iTunes or Apple Music or whatever are not really scaring us because Bear Family always has focused on two aspects that make a product valuable. One, of course, is the music, which, as you said, is mostly available on iTunes or whatever. But second is the information that goes along with it. The information, the images, the photos, discographies. So well, say the old-fashioned way of consuming something, like reading a book, like putting a vinyl on the turntable. All these things are very important to us, and I think also to the people that are buying Bear Family product.
Do you not see younger audiences coming in to fill in the gap that's left by the older audiences leaving?
Uh, I think that definitely we are catering to younger artists as well, especially in the field of rockabilly. And rockabilly always seems to be renewing the group that's developing an interest in the music. So there is, not that much of a gap. But let's say take vintage country music, for example, the old stuff, music from the 1920s, 1930s, or into the 50s before Nashville became, a pop music center. So these fans definitely that were living out in the country, these fans are more or less, declining and disappearing slowly.
Mm. That's concerning for me because I love this stuff. I'll pull a few things here. You guys are doing how would you define the scope of the company? It's such a wide net, but how would you define
Mhm.
it?
Well, it's not easy to describe, So basically, I would say we're coming from vintage American music. So from old time music, from country music, early rock and roll, rockabilly, and then finally in the 1980s, Bear Family expanded its catalog. We for a while, Bear Family did a lot of European music, especially German music. We did documentations on German chanson singers, on soundtracks, on whatever you can name. Probably Bear Family had it. We did a documentation on Jewish music under Nazi Berlin from 1933 to 1942. We did a lot of crazy stuff, which was actually getting far away from what Bear Family originally put out. Um, but in the end, I must say that we're still, having that certain nucleus, and that's vintage American music. We just did, of course, something, totally different, like, a crowd documentation on German prog rock. We issued a total of, I think, 8 double CD sets. We're planning to do some blues stuff. I'm working on a box set on the history of Michael Bloomfield, that kind of stuff. So a little different from what Bear Family used to do. We're just having ready for a late October release a documentation concerning music by artists that were originally inspired by Bob Dylan in the 1960s, so contemporary guys, So that's something very special, but still, we're still doing what we always did, and this is just rediscovering something and putting it out in certain formats.
Well, and you do it very well. And I wanted to talk about some of
Thank
these
you.
releases, especially some of the later, some of the newer things, because they I love this stuff, but the curation that goes into some of these collections presents things that I might not know about in a way that feels fresh and new. These are two different compilations that take
Oh,
different approaches
mhm,
on
mhm,
basically country and rhythm and blues or beat music. So Shotgun
mhm,
Boogie is rhythm and blues goes country. So that's gonna be rhythm and blues artists
mhm.
performing traditionally country songs.
Right.
And then Beaten on country music, which is going to be beat music approach. If for people that we're talking about, the early to mid 60s beat music scene, again covering country. So it's a spin on traditional music through a lens that I don't think we have seen a lot of as far as curated collections like this. How are things curated? Because I mean, okay, here's another one. This is one of my favorites. This is Destination. This is so wacky, right? It's
It
so
is.
wacky, but
Yeah.
it's so much. And there's songs on here that I'm, I know Alley Oop, but then there's a version of Alley Oop I
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah,
familiar
yeah.
with. So I'm curious a little bit about the curation that goes into some of these things, how that's decided upon, how they're actually produced.
Well, actually, it's we have so many ideas. These compilations, these theme products, as we call it,
Mhm.
um, are house made. So Nico is one of our house producers. Mark is another one, a freelancer who's working for us. He has like 20 or 30 different projects, just in the can, and he could put that out
Wow.
easily. He's such a crazy collector, and he always has a different twist. Uh, for looking at things and looking at facts and looking at a region, looking at a theme. So, you know, in Europe, beat music was very big, but it was just beat music. So there was no rock from the US, it was just beat music. And beat music, every school here had its own beat band. I was playing one, and then everybody was playing beat. But there were so many different, influences coming over from the UK in most cases, like country songs that were interpreted by a beat band, being a beat band from Germany, from the UK, maybe, Scandinavia, which had a great scene in those days. So beating on country music definitely was something that people that were growing up with that music in those days always had on their mind. And so, this is for us, it's more like a natural thing that it finally, got into shape and was a Bear Family release or Jurassic Park, so this it's,
Yeah.
Jurassic Land. It's just a crazy thing. But I think music, besides all the, let's say, the seriousness, it always has to entertain. And
Mhm.
even if you're catering to a collector and I say a well-experienced man like you are, you listen to a lot of music, and if you say, okay, there's something on there that I never heard about, that I even
Mhm.
didn't know about, so I think that makes us proud, so that's one of the things that we want to do. We want to be different, we're not an out of copyright company from Europe that's just collecting stuff that has been recollected and reproduced all the time. No, we're always looking for something different.
You just mentioned out of copyright.
Mhm.
The copyright laws in Europe have made it possible for easier access to some of this music. Has that helped things? I know that you don't just do that, but has that helped with preserving the past with these curated collections like this, or even with the more focused artist-centric box sets?
I think it has made things easier, especially for those who just focus on out of copyright releases. So if you say, okay, we're doing nothing but really re-releasing something that has been released, prior to 1963, we have always been cooperating with the major industry. So we're licensing from Sony, Warner, Universal. Universal and Sony are our biggest partners. And of course, we are in the position that we can't say, hey, we want to do a compilation on somebody with a range from, let's say, 1952 to 1968. And well, we would like to license from you the tracks that were released between 63 and 68, because the others we don't license because it's in the public domain. And then, of course, Universal would say, hey, if you want to get those tracks, which are, copyrighted, then of course you also have to license the other ones. So for us, actually, in terms of financing a project, it's not a benefit. The out of copyright law that we have here, or the copyright law that we have here with that certain limitation, because in that case, I wouldn't call them competitors, but other, smaller record companies that are
Mhm.
focusing on nothing but that are in a very better position than we are. If it comes to the terms of preserving something, I would say yes, it's definitely easier in Europe to reissue something that has been out on the market. But when it comes to putting out something that has never been released before, then out of copyright 1963 limitation doesn't do us any good, because we have to license and get that anyway, you
Mhm.
know. So I don't, well, you know. it's the way it is, you know.
As you go to these companies, okay, we should mention some of the huge box sets. I'm thinking of the Louisiana Hayride box set that
Hmm.
came out. I think that's 20 discs. You guys have done these huge, focused collections that can span years
Hmm.
for, I'm thinking of George Jones. I'm thinking of Wanda Jackson. I mean, we could just name many of these artists, but do you Jerry Lee Lewis specifically? I wanted to ask you about Jerry Lee Lewis because I know there was the Sun. There have been a few collections, but there was the Sun Records collection that was expansive and um, I would say exhaustive as well. Are there is there more? I guess my question is, are the vaults being emptied? Are you still able to access this material? Are this many years into things, is it starting to get harder to put those collections out?
It's definitely harder to get these collections out because when Bear Family started reissuing material in cooperation with record companies like EMI, Capitol, RCA in those days, um, it was, Richard succeeded in getting access to physical archives. You know what I mean? So
Mhm.
he went to, let's say, the Capitol Tower in Los Angeles and Hollywood, and and he doors were open for him. He could enter, the vaults, and he could see, sometimes tape boxes were not correctly, indicated. So, sometimes he found, alternate takes, and of course, he brought that to the attention of the people that were responsible for that. But in that case, somebody with Richard's knowledge, and he just could do a lot of research work directly on the spot, and that's over because these people that had been working during those days, 1980s, 1990s, have been working at major record labels. They knew something about the music, and all these people are gone. So they were in those days, they were in their 50s maybe, and they grew older and older and retired. And nobody was really stepping, and were getting into this there, what's that there, followed up, so the doors were closed.
Mhm.
And then, of course, let's say the digital breakthrough changed a lot in the behavior of the major industry. So the major industry were not really, for a certain amount of time, they were not really interested in supporting physical record labels any longer because they were trying to exploit their material that they had by, digital sales, first downloads and now streaming, you know. So this has changed a lot, and this is something to do with different generations now being responsible for giving access or for denying it, and to find people outside of, let's say, some headquarters that are interested in what we are doing, preserving something, unearthing. That's very difficult. That has become difficult. Plus, I must admit, excuse me, plus I must admit that, of course, during the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, early 2000s, Bear Family has released, I don't know exactly, but more than 400 box sets, I would say. And most of the stuff that was really, of interest to us has been out, like the Everly Brothers complete stuff, all these Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash, whatever we did, so it's more or less a complete retrospective, including a lot, mostly all the previously unissued recordings. And so we're more focusing on theme boxes like the Bakersfield Sound, Louisiana Hayride, something like that, or recently the Memphis Blues box, something like that. Or I'm trying to expand the horizon a little bit by, working on that Michael Bloomfield set that we're now planning. But it's, I would say Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis, Chuck Berry, everything, all the big names have been covered.
What you're telling me lines up with what I hear from people in the film industry too, which is that anyone at the labels or the studios that control the archives are being the people that knew what they were talking about and knew the catalog are being
Mhm.
they're aging out, and the people that are coming in come from other businesses and don't have a vested interest
Mhm.
in the preservation of these of the art. I think it's art and it needs to be preserved. Do you see I'm kind of looking to the future with what we're seeing now in the next 5 to 10 to 15, 20 years from now. Do you think there might be a resurgence? Do you think that there might be people that come in that love this stuff? Or do you think that the fear is always that this will be lost, you know? And I
Mhm.
know you've put out an awful lot of music already. So you've done the job, you've done the
Yeah,
work,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
you know, as I worry about future generations. You know, you're already talking about the older audience aging out and disappearing, it's so important to me that younger audiences come in and fill that gap. Do you see that happening maybe with access, or do you see the doors continuing to close?
I think there are so many different points to consider if you're looking, for perspective into the future. Um, I don't see a positive development in terms of getting access to, closed archives. Um, there's another aspect that's very important regarding historical recordings. We were talking and focusing on music from, let's say, the 1920s into the early 1960s. So that was our basic, main business. In those days, it was easy for record companies to sign artists to their labels and sometimes paying them next to nothing.
Mhm.
So artists in those days, in the early days of recording industry, were most of them were cheated and just they got pennies instead of dollars. This changed in the 1960s, and of course, artist contracts are different when you look at, let's say, recordings from 1967, 68 onwards. A good example, for example, is the Next Stop Vietnam box set that we did. And I was doing a lot of research and finding out who might be right owners. And with the major industry, it's easy. We have our local contacts here, our national contacts in Germany, so that's easy. And for example, I was asking for, a certain Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young song that should be included on that compilation because that was the kind of music that, American troops were listening to while serving in Vietnam. Um, and we didn't get any further because from the record company in those days, it just said, okay, we have forwarded your request to the band's lawyer. Okay, so never got a reply,
Yeah.
because they said, okay, what are they doing? They are putting out a box set that sells maybe 2,000 or 3,000 units if it's well done, and it's one track out of 425. So how much money is in there? You know,
Yeah.
and this is a situation that we are always confronted with. Sometimes we get along pretty well, in the case of Bob Dylan, for example, which is very easy for us because Bob himself loves what we're doing. So, and he has quite a serious collection, as we know. Um, in other cases, it's always as easy, but in other cases, even with pretty unknown artists or bands, you don't get any further because you never receive a reply. And then, if the, let's say, contractual situation in the record company's headquarters is not clear, they of course they can't give us permission to use that material on our releases. So that's more or less my concern.
You realize you're preserving history. And I know this is important to you because you've been the recipient of multiple blues awards. I mean, you are at the forefront of preservation. And
Mhm.
I don't know, for me, I'm very history focused, and I think that it's important not just to enjoy something, but also to share it and to save it. And that's so much of what you do. So, well, first of all, thank you for that. But I assume that's one of the goals and all that you do is to, well, let's save this. Let's get this in front of people. Let's
Mhm.
so they can hear it and continue. So it lives on beyond us and continues into the next generation.
Yeah, I think that was always has been the intention of Bear Family. Whoever was, at the wheel in those days, Richard started that company because he found it difficult to find enough material for filling up his mail order catalog. He started this company as a mail order company for country and Western collectors in Germany, basically, but also in Europe. And he found it difficult because he once told me that when he started in 75, he wanted to have some Johnny Cash albums in the catalog, and there wasn't any available. No, except for, let's say, the two or three latest albums on CBS in those days, but anything else was deleted. The Sun material was not available. And he knew about a recording that was made but never released. And so he approached and found out that companies like EMI in those days, or CBS, which had offices in Germany, that they had special product departments. So for example, Reader's Digest or Time Life or whatever these major companies were doing, they were licensing or producing records in cooperation with the industry. And so Richard approached them and said, "Hey, well, I've got an idea and I want to do this and that." And so he was, or the reaction to his suggestions was very positive. And so he started this line of, putting out stuff that has been or had been deleted for a long time, original album from the 1960s, something like that. But he always was trying to add more to it, not just doing a one-to-one release, but doing it as complete as possible. And I think in 1980, so after 5 years after the company was founded, the first Bill Haley box set came out, a vinyl LP box set in those days. And definitely his main intention was to preserve the music that he loved because it wasn't available at all. And he was just thinking of, whatever, that these tapes would get lost forever, or take Universal Music, for example, where the whole warehouse with all the old tapes was burning down, a couple of years later. Mm-hmm. So he really tried hard to preserve the music that was, lying at his heart. So, all the old country singers, the good ones, and then later on rockabilly and rock and roll. So that was the original intention. Today, with let's say billions of digital audio files, all most of the music that has been recorded in the past 120 years is somehow preserved on digital files, on a hard disk or wherever, So I think the unearthing or the access to historical material is not the point where we are at these days, because everything is somehow available. But putting it into a context, like with the compilations, which are more for entertainment value, or if you go to retrospectives of a certain, recording scene like Bakersfield, I think that's our task these days, because just a file and listening to music in the background while, you're doing some cooking, it's a totally different situation, what you love and what I love, listening to it, learning about it, and getting all the informations, that are connected to the recording process, to the people that performed on the album, on the recordings, learning, who's playing bass on that track, or whatever, all these in detail info. This is something where, I think we are taking care of like nobody else. Maybe not like in the Attic, Not in the Attic is a great label.
Do you have a favorite or a few favorite releases that have been released during your tenure?
Well, actually, I could,
Am I asking you to choose your favorite child?
Well, I would say, it's very simple because I'm a vinyl guy. I love vinyl music, vinyl products. So I would say I have two favorites. One from the old days, which has been out for a long time, which is Jerry Lee Lewis at the Star Club in Hamburg, which is one of my all-time, I think, the all-time greatest live recordings ever made. And the other ones would be Dan Pan's album, his first album release that we re-released on vinyl. And of course, the Next Stop Vietnam box set. So that's something, because, I was 16 when I first demonstrated, when I was on the streets and demonstrating for,
Hmm.
hey guys, stop the war in Vietnam. And that was in 1968, so that's something I grew up with, and I was very happy to being part of, the project team that was putting together this major thing, for us, and talking to veterans was amazing, because we were talking to people from, let's say, from the left wing and also, of course, from the right wing. And I can remember one telephone conversation I had with a bomber pilot who was serving in Korea and then in Vietnam, and he had recorded some pro Vietnam War songs after he got home. And the first thing he sent me was a bunch of photos, all with him with his bomber, so with his aircraft, and that was pretty weird. On the other hand, you were talking to people that were more, let's say, influenced by people like Country Joe, more critical. Um, and I think that really was an experience for me to say, well, this is something that's important. That's something we have to preserve, and that's what we did. So that's the same thing which has been done a few years earlier with that Nazi recording Jewish music in Nazi Berlin. So that's something very special. So that's what I personally really appreciate and like.
I'm glad you mentioned Jerry Lee Lewis too. He was an artist that was always, well, after the initial 50s first wave, he was an artist that I think really was unappreciated. And even up until his death, it wasn't the huge national news that it should have been. He was one of the rock and roll survivors. He was the
Hmm.
last man standing. And
Hmm.
I always appreciate when anybody can hone in on what Jerry Lee Lewis represented for multiple kinds of music. Might there be anything else coming out? I know you guys have been really good to Jerry Lee Lewis. Is there anything else that you see down the road?
Well, the only Jerry Lewis album that we would like to put out is a little difficult to realize. It's a recording that he did in the UK for Decca in the 60s, in the mid 60s. So there are some legal issues regarding this. So I think that's the only album that Bear Family maybe would like to reissue if it would become, the chance to do so. Anything else has been reissued.
Mhm.
Anything else is out on the market. And surprisingly, Jerry Lee is our best-selling single artist. Yeah,
Really?
yeah. So, the Star Club album that I just mentioned, it's selling like hotcakes, and definitely also to younger people. Um, the box set itself, very expensive, definitely, sold pretty well for us. And compared to Chuck Berry, who definitely is the bigger name, our people, the people that are, loving Bear Family product, prefer Jerry Lee.
Well,
Yeah.
that's good to know. I would not have perceived that. So that's
No,
great.
it's amazing. Okay, we've put out quite a lot of stuff,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
and even his gospel recording that came out on Bear Family. This is selling, like something I would have never expected. So, but very
But
special.
I talk about him flying under the radar. Even when he died, his funeral was kind of open. They had a service that was open to the public. You would think that it would have been like the gates of Graceland or something with thousands of people there to pay respects, but that's not how it was. And so it, I feel defensive about that.
Yeah, but I think that Jerry Lee, let's say, if you compare Jerry Lee to, let's say, Chuck Berry, for example.
Hmm.
Jerry Lee definitely is a person that was, dividing
Yes.
people into either being fans or, hey, this guy is, so weird. I don't want to deal with him.
Yeah.
I think that's something, what happened in his younger days. I think this is something that was still uh, in the public, and the public in a certain, what's that, in the media, that Jerry Lee is a good artist or was a great piano player, rock and roll guy, but wild and, crazy. And he was
Mhm.
not so compatible, as many of his contemporaries. But I like that, So if somebody is a little, out of his mind,
Yeah,
uh, in a certain way, he's also really creative in a different sense than others are.
yeah.
So, take Paul
I'm
McCartney
sure.
and take Keith Richards, So, for
Oh yeah.
example, you can guess who my favorite would be.
I was gonna say, I'm sure you've been to Sun Studios in Memphis, and you know that there's that piano with uh, cigar, the burn from where he put out his cigar
Yeah.
on the piano keys. Yeah. But you said you're a vinyl guy. As we wind down, I would be remiss if I did not mention that one of my favorite things that Bear Family Records does is these 10-inch collections, and there have been many of them. Let me hold up to the camera here. This is just one of the flyers that shows some of the 10-inch vinyls, the 10-inch vinyl records that have been issued by you guys. And one of the things that you do that I think is wonderful is in addition to the 10-inch, many times whenever possible, there's also a CD in there as well with more than will fit on the 10-inch and booklets for one of the things that's emerged in this conversation is that context is very important. The history, the story of the music is very important, and that's always included with these. So I love these. I wanted to let you know what a fan I am of these and to maybe see if you wanted to talk a little bit about the vinyl initiative from Bear Family.
Okay, so Beer Family started out as a vinyl company, so for the first, let's say 15 years or so, we didn't do anything but vinyl. But of course, things changed. And for the box sets, especially for the box sets, the CD format was much better to use than vinyl, just of practical purposes. It's cheaper, it's easier to handle, it doesn't weigh that much, it doesn't take that much space. So, but on the other hand, Beer Family and our contributors, of course, always loved vinyl because that's the format we grew up with. Um, so when we decided after taking over in 2014, when we decided to change or add something to the normal Beer Family catalog, we were thinking about, okay, who might be interested in purchasing, let's say, one-to-one reissues of very rare albums. Most 12-inch albums in those days, we're talking about 10 years ago, um, the important ones all have been or had been reissued one to one, by the majors, by companies like Bertus over here in Europe. So the market was flooded with 12-inch vinyl LPs. But the real collector, he loves 10 inches, excerpts from 12-inch albums, usually, not always, and released in the most obscure countries where you would never expect that they released American rock and roll music, for example, country music, in the 1950s and early 1960s, like Japan, South Africa. The Jerry Lee Lewis album is in South African release, and from Korea, Argentina, whatever, So, and we said, okay, as we have, access to the collections of several serious collectors, and they had the originals in their personal archive. So we said, okay, we're going to do it, remaster it so that the sound will be perfect, good cutting, good pressing, and then add some extra values to it. But basically, it's a one-to-one reissue. The music is well known. It has been, available all the time, but not in that format and not in that, what's that, packaging, So the sleeve is important. And then we added something, if possible, like what's that, a postcard or an autograph card, something like that to it. And for a while, we found out that collectors appreciated CDs as a free giveaway as part of the package because in those days, let's say 10 years ago, 8 years ago, especially in Europe, most cars still had CD players. But that's over. And when you buy a new car, you don't get a CD player anymore. And so the demand for this extra bonus CD, that was really declining. And so we said, okay, so we just leave it out. Nobody is really asking for it any longer. And so we just focused on the vinyl, and that's it.
Gotcha. Well, I want to thank you for being so generous with your time and for talking to me about what you're doing. Anything that you want to talk, is there something you would like to talk about that I didn't ask you about before I let you go?
Well, their family, will celebrate its 50th anniversary in the business next year. 20, 25, 50 years in the business, a long, long time. And of course, we will celebrate this. And I think, we deserve it. The fans deserve it. The music world deserves it. And, well, of course, we are just trying to address this to everybody who's interested in what we are doing, and maybe we can talk about Bear Family once again in about a year or so, and talk about the anniversary and what we had plans for to do that, and whatever will happen then. So that would be something that we definitely might be returning to.
Well, I would love to do that. Obviously, we want people to go to the website. We want people to follow Bear Family on social media. Is there anywhere else you want them to check you out, or is any outlet that you want to mention?
No, not really. So
Okay.
we're putting out like 3, 4 releases a month, and everybody who's interested in, to follow up on what we're doing, just, I'm referring to the Facebook side or to our own website where you will find all the new releases and also the back catalog, of course. No, I'm really happy, talking to somebody like you. Thank you very much, Heath. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
Because I think, if it wouldn't be for people like you, we would be lost. So you are the people that we are depending on and catering to.
Yes. Well, I appreciate that. You make it easy because you put out such incredible work that appeals to both the collector, the musicologist as well. And you make it very approachable, you make it very fun, you make it very presentable. It's fun to follow this stuff. It doesn't, it shouldn't feel like homework, it should feel like a joy. And you do make it a joy. So
Oh,
thank you so much for that. And thank you for
thank
your
you very
time
much.
today.
Thank you very much for your kind words. Have a good day.